Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning. Welcome to camp. I'm really happy that you decided to join this evening with us. Welcome to a lecture called Towards Community Places. It's a lecture that belongs to project Hyperlocal, and this project focuses on significance and role of a non-profit organization and community groups in urban development and the development of public spaces. That means that we will hear buzzwords like participation, public space, community, etc., etc. And these topics are really vibrant right now in Czech Republic. Since we learned terms like brownfields, participation, cooperation. Now we are really focused on quality of public space, but we are trying to find a way how to improve even small places that are related to few people, that are related to a small borough. And we will discuss this with people that are really real professionals in this, because they are focused on the topics for decades, not just for years like we are here in Prague, even if we are pioneers within the Czech Republic. We will explore the topic of community and participatory planning. We will discuss locally oriented democratic and sustainable solutions for urban spaces, and you will have a chance to ask questions as you are used to. And if you would like to ask questions via Slido, you can use app slido.com. If you will use hashtag Hyperlocal, you will be able to fill the form and ask the question. We would have an amazing opportunity to see lectures or speakers related to Pratt Institute. Ronald Shiffman, welcome to camp. Yvette Shiffman, welcome here. David Burney, welcome to camp. Eva Hanhardt and Eve Baron. So, thank you for a warm welcome. After the lectures, you will have a chance to discuss with them. So prepare your questions if you would like to. But first, I would like to give the floor to Yvette Vashorková, co-founder of Center for Central European Architecture.
Does it work? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So thank you. Welcome, distinguished guests from New York, my very great professors from Pratt Institute. And welcome all the guests here. I'm very happy, and it's great that you find the time, and also in this crazy situation with the public transport renovation. So thank you very much to be here. And I just would like very shortly, briefly, to just present the project which actually came to the idea during my Fulbright scholarship, where I was, in fact, we just came in April, I came back from New York, where I spent great 9 months, and also in the great department and the School of Architecture at Pratt Institute, the Graduate Center for Planning and Environment. And I actually, together with the professors from that institute, I offered them, let's go into Prague and let's talk about your great work, what you do here. And actually, I will not talk too long, but actually inspired me was that actually we all know about the recent great development of New York, especially during the beginning of the 2000s, during Bloomberg era, and all the changes. But actually, I found out that everything could be possible only because of hard work and hard kind of constant debates and discussions about actually involving the communities as well, and talking about sustainability, talking about resilience on the through, let's say, I would say through 60s, or even maybe before. But that's very important, and that's why I decided to organize this event, to talk about how we can try to develop the trust between the bottom-up and top-down methods, and between the all stakeholders, to talk with civic organizations, citizens, also the city of Prague. And actually, the camp is a great example of this kind of process of discussing how we would like to live, livable, how we would like to live in the future. Also, it's important to tell that this is also a topic of the European Union today, and the European Bauhaus is very much also, of course, focusing on the topic of the communities and how the communities can really shift the development in our cities. So, and with that, I would like to end, but before I end and give the floor to our distinguished guests, I would like just to mention our collaborators or our co-organizers of that event, which is the Pratt Institute GCPE, which is the Institute of Planning of Prague, Faculty of Fine Arts at the Technical University in Brno, Faculty of Architecture, Technical University of Brno, AKIP, Architecture Institute in Prague. And I would like also to thank very much to our partners, because it was not so easy to organize this event with actually coming back from New York with very no budget for that event. And I'm very grateful for our partners, which we found in the 2 months. And this is the Office of the Creative Europe, the Foundation VIA, the Foundation Tipsport, Karel Komárek Family Foundation, and MMCITE. And because we have serious plans with more discussing this topic with different cities, authorities, and people working for planning, we are very grateful for the auspices, and we have the auspices of the Ivan Bartoš, Deputy Prime Minister of the Czech Republic for Digitalization and Minister of the Regional Planning, Development, I'm sorry, then the Embassy of the United States in the Czech Republic, and Petr Hlaváček, Deputy Mayor of the City of Prague. So I hope this will be kind of the starting point, not the starting, we already start with all these topics, but this could push and more, let's say, make the communities involved for future in our planning. So thank you very much for the possibility of the camp, of this great venue, which we love all. And I will give back the mic to Jiří.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and especially for the introduction that you mentioned when you mentioned the Bloomberg era, which is like when you Google something about New York, you find out that there is some person called Bloomberg, and he changed everything. But the continuity is very important, and the local knowledge is very important, and thanks to the changes from decade to decade, was possible what happened in decades that are well known to us and worked as a big inspiration for us. So I'm really happy that we have guests that remembers the continuity, that know about this knowledge and can teach us more about how to start this big change that we still work on in Prague. So first, I would like to give a floor to Ron Shiffman, co-founder of the Pratt Institute Center for Community and Environmental Development. Welcome to camp.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Just being in this building and seeing what you're doing has made me very, very excited. It's a dynamic place, what you call camp, and I think you should be proud of it. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I have been to Prague a number of times, not for many years, but it was in the late 80s and beginning of 90s, and it was a completely different city at that point in time. Over the years, I've learned to love both the city and the work that has been done and has grown out of the city. And so it's a pleasure to be here. It's my task today to present to you some of the reasons or some of the work that has been done at Pratt that makes it a very unique place. You'll hear words, as our moderator said, about public space and housing and things of that sort, but you're going to hear a couple of other words, and I'm going to bring them up during the course of the conversation, but I should alert you. One of them is democracy, and one of them is justice. And I think part of that is what really motivates many of us at Pratt to be involved in planning. How do we bring about the kind of social changes that are necessary to create healthy and viable environments that deal with issues that are social, economic, as well as political and physical? And what you see here are some of the inspiration for it. And we have to take a step back because the Pratt Center or Pratt Institution learned about advocacy and pluralism in planning by working with people. And the pictures you see here are some of the people we've worked with over the years, and some of the contexts in which we were forced to work. And part of that, was the abandonment of cities. The 60s were a time of turmoil, and I must say we're in a time of turmoil and challenge. And many of you young professionals, I think, are going to have to take on those challenges. And what we were experiencing at that time was a war on poverty. That our new president, or let me step back. What we began to experience then was that there was a recognition that there was, in the United States, two countries, one rich and one poor, and that had to be addressed, and the great divisions that existed in our society. So we had a young man who was beginning to run for president and ran for president and was elected by the name of John F. Kennedy, who then took on some of the aspirations that came out of some of the intellectuals and some of the movements that were taking place in the United States and declared a war on poverty. And what did that mean? How do we really abolish or uproot poverty and create and build a strong society? But we were also caught up in a war in Vietnam, which many of us believed we should not have been fighting. It was a war of aggression in many ways. We also had we started as a country with aspirations as being a democracy freed from colonialism. But the fact of the matter is that the country was built on a major flaw, which was slavery, and that we needed to address the social and economic and racial inequities that had existed in our society. We began to see the beginning of the women's movement or the reemergence of the women's movement, and the environmental concerns began to be on our list. It wasn't climate change then, but it was how do we create healthy and viable environments to raise our children and future generations. And there was, again, at universities throughout the United States and in France and parts of Western Europe, the universities were calling attention to what was going on in their cities. And we had major unrest in many of our cities, or political turmoil. And that's the context in which we got started. What you see in that picture, let me just go back, is the March on Washington. It was organized, and over 250,000 people attended that. It was a march for civil rights and justice and jobs. And it was formed by on August 1963, so you can understand the years that it took place. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is when some of us were waiting to get on the bus to go to that march. And people were looking at us and saying, "What are you doing?" There was a total disbelief that a march would attain the numbers that came out. People were surprised when you came back. It was really a very dynamic situation. But what did our cities look like? And the building you see there was very typical. In the late 60s or into the early 70s, New York City was experiencing the abandonment of between 30,000 apartments a year to 36,000 apartments. And at that time, I made a speech that if a foreign enemy had ever bombed 5 buildings a day of 20 families, we would have mobilized all our resources to defeat that enemy. That enemy were our own banks and our government that was not concerned about the livelihoods of people in the city. And so that was basically something that the students in the universities of architecture, and my university, where I was a student, actually. I was a student at Pratt. It's been a life sentence of over 60 years. And when we looked out the building, out of our school building, we saw this kind of thing occurring in the neighborhood around us. Yet when we were being taught in the classroom, we were being taught to design houses for the rich or beach houses for people to parade in, but rarely were we dealing with the issues that surrounded us. So we began to look at and seeing how we can begin to engage the community surrounding us, and we didn't have to look too far because a group of ministers from the adjoining community of Bedford-Stuyvesant, a community of about 250,000 people at that time, maybe more, maybe less, depending on how you drew the boundaries, was beginning to suffer greatly from the kind of abandonment you saw and the high rates of unemployment and social dislocation. And we were asked by those ministers to work with them on a blueprint for the revitalization of their community. And what you see here is an article that appeared in a now defunct newspaper called the Herald Tribune, or I believe that's where it's from. And it really describes the plan. But it grew out of discussions that the community leaders had. The two people you see here are two of my major professors. One of them is Elsie Richardson, and the other is a woman by the name of Shirley Chisholm. You probably don't know those names, except maybe Shirley. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman to run for president of the United States. And these were two civic leaders in the community that were talking about how do we revitalize the community. And they didn't talk about it in the way that we normally talk about it as architects and planners and others. They talked about how we dealt with education and housing and healthcare and the whole set of things, all of these strands that make a healthy and viable community, as well as the physical environment. And they talked about that in a holistic way. And when we plan, we usually talk about planning with participation, but we come in there saying, well, how do you want to participate to develop housing? But you don't know what the community really needs. What is the breadth and depth of their needs, and how do they really want to begin to investigate the changes in their neighborhoods, and how do they want to revitalize it? And out of that plan came an idea of creating a social, economic, and physical revitalization strategy, where the physical environment became the economic and became the engine that pulled along the economic and social and other kinds of benefits in the community. And what you see here were the plans coming to fruition or being proposed. But wherever the community took those plans, they were told that they can't get it because they didn't have the political power. The congressional district that Shirley eventually filled didn't exist in Bedford-Stuyvesant at that time. It was divided into 3 or 4 different districts. So they had no congressional representation. They had no city council representation. They had no state assembly representation. And so part and parcel of what we began doing with the community right at the beginning was developing the planning arguments for the legal fight to create those new political boundaries. And over time, that actually took place, and they began to have at least the political power. And then they also needed some champions for what they were doing. And one of the people who would listen to the plans as we went from city agency to city agency was a member of New York City's Planning Commission who said, you know, Bobby Kennedy, who was then unfortunately, John Kennedy was assassinated, but his younger brother, Bobby Kennedy, was going to run for Senate in the New York State, and he was looking for a community in which to really make his name. And perhaps he'll visit with you. And we negotiated and went between Kennedy's office and the community, and finally said, you can visit, but we want something substantive. We didn't want a photo op. We wanted to make sure that what your visit would result in change. And so he came out and supported what was a community effort that basically said, look, if government can't do it for us, we want to create our own corporation. We want to bring together our citizens, the people who live in this neighborhood. We want to bring together the businesses, and we want to get advice from various different sectors, from the architects, from lawyers, from the business community, and we would like to develop our own community-controlled corporation. And out of that grew the idea for a community development corporation. And Kennedy bought into that, and he advocated for it, and out of that grew the Central Brooklyn Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation. That corporation was one of 2 or 3 that were established throughout the United States. There was one in Huff, in Cleveland, there was one on the West Coast in Los Angeles, and Bedford-Stuyvesant was the first and largest that was launched. And that led to a great deal of activity. And you see here the various different political leadership. Bobby Kennedy's all the way here on your left. And then Mayor Lindsay is in the middle, and we had about 500 or 600 people show up at community meetings announcing the development of the corporation. That corporation then went on to deal with things like the economy, housing, social and education programs, weaving together the elements that create community, that create a vitality in an area. And what did we learn from that? We learned that it's important to, whenever you're dealing with something, is to focus on place and community. And we developed an idea that you can't really deal with place and community unless you're able to, in some way, create affect public policy. How do you really build public policy? How do you provide technical assistance in architecture, in community economic development, and urban planning? And then how do you build the capacity? Because you don't want to be dependent on outsiders. You really want to build within the community the various different capacities. So what you see here is what eventually evolved into the Pratt Center, where what we did is, at the university, we created an office that was not an academic institution, but it operated 12 months a year on a non-academic calendar, working with community-based organizations to create their strategies for improvement. And so we provided the technical assistance, but the technical assistance came up with plans sometimes on a local level that didn't have the public policy to implement the plans. So we began working on the public policy. And we then worked with 2 or 3 communities that shared the same deficits and the same options that they wanted for development. And we worked with them to pull together the public policy activities. And then we were able to understand what the weaknesses in the community were in terms of skills that they needed to develop. And we also learned what the deficiencies were in the planning profession and the architecture profession and the skills that we needed to attain. So we couldn't only just design good buildings, but we had to be able to know how to finance them. We had to know the economic and social impacts as well. So what we developed is that process, each of these feeding and reinforcing the other. And so that we became better educators, both for our students and building the capacity of the community, people that we worked with, because we knew them quite well, and we knew what the public policy is. Engagement was a mutual education process. We learned from the community, they learned from us, and collectively we learned about things we would never have learned about if we didn't have that sort of synergistic chemistry underway. And then we were able to deal with public policy, and we worked on public policy by developing relationships both on a local level and on a statewide level and on a national level. And so we were able to meet, undertake an issue like one of the major problems that we faced in the 60s and 70s was racial discrimination in terms of mortgage lending and being able to buy a home, in getting investments in the cities. And so what we began to do is work with groups in Chicago that were facing, again, what we call redlining, this financial discrimination based on place. And we worked with people in Chicago and Philadelphia and other places to then impact the federal laws that required banks to declare where they got their deposit from and then where do they lend. And what we used to see is that they would get their deposits from small people in the community, but they would lend to corporations that may have been elsewhere and not really in any way helping them economically. And so with that, we got federal legislation that required local banks to declare where they got the money and where they spent it. And by getting that information, we were able to challenge the local banks to start financing these communities. And then the next step was to get the federal government not only to provide information, but to require them to affirmatively lend in low-income communities. And that led to a number of basic improvements over time. But I want to step back 1 second and say, what did we do at the Pratt Center? We put together that team and that model, but we also had a set of values that we thought were important, and we learned and developed this list of values prior to the values for sustainable development. But if you look at this, it's equitable and qualitative development. We didn't only want development to take place that led to profits for individuals, but we wanted the quality of the community to grow. We really wanted to get substantive participation of the poor, not just an empowerment of the poor, not just lip service, or and my colleague Eva Hanhardt may go through the ladder of participation. You don't want people to just tell you what color to be of a building, but you want them to tell you what they want built. And so we wanted really a greater level of participatory processes. We wanted a holistic and integrated development, and we wanted to value and enhance indigenous development and indigenous leadership. And we wanted to, over time, understand that one of our goals is to create, within a pluralistic society, a greater and a stronger democracy. And what did that mean? It meant that every group within that democracy had the right to be represented in the planning process. And so one of the things we came to believe is that good planning is a result of vision, reason, and democracy. Planning is a vision is the ability to see and develop alternative approaches. Reason is a trust in the capacity of the mind to understand nature and society. And democracy is to trust the people and the capacity of the people for self-governance. And reason is dependent on a rational systemic analysis. And some of us know that in the way we learn and are educated in universities, but we get to understand it more when we're working with the people who will be affected by that. Again, a mutual education process. Democracy depends on the empowerment and participation of the poor. And vision is dependent on ingenuity and creativity. That's where the role of many of the planners and architects come in as well. And so it's a synthesis of the professional working with the community actually driving the car. And one of the things we always put in here, this is important, and democracy is important, as long as the interests of minorities and the less powerful and future generations are respected. And that leads us to the concepts of sustainability. There were other people who were working on it and coming up with the ideas in the legal profession of having low-income people being represented in planning, represented in a variety of other community functions. And out of that came what we called advocacy and pluralism in planning. It was a seminal paper written by Linda and Paul Davidoff that resulted in really providing using the services of architects and planners to function much the way we do in the legal profession, so they're all represented. It meant understanding plans as well as issues. It meant finding resolution and moving ahead. Eva may talk about Nos Quedamos. That's the alternative plan that she may focus on a little bit later. And I wanted to really stress this side because we're all professionals in this room. And it says, this was a speech by a civil rights leader, the head of the Urban League, which at that time was one of the largest civil rights groups in the country. And he went to a convention in Portland of architects at the U.S. Level, at the federal level, not in the city, not the state, but in the federal level, and basically said that as a profession, you're not a profession that has distinguished itself by your social and civic contributions to the cause of civil rights. And he goes on to say, you are most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance. And today, many architects and planners continue to be irrelevant. We're irrelevant if we allow poverty to exist in our cities. We're irrelevant if we allow discrimination to exist in our cities. We're irrelevant if we don't deal with the environmental injustices that are in our cities. And so that, to me, was really a foundation of what many of the programs we developed. Here you see some of the meetings that we held during the 70s and 80s, dealing with new programs that grew out of our efforts and efforts of the community and efforts around the country. We saw communities putting up signs, improve, don't move, or don't move, improve. We saw some of our neighbors there beginning to clean up the vacant lots that were sprouting up all over the South Bronx. So residents began to organize to stabilize and realize their neighborhoods. There were people like the Harlem Renegades, a fighting gang that decided to put down their colors and not fight any longer, and took over vacant and abandoned buildings and forced the city to give them loans to rehabilitate the buildings so their members could have a place to live. And you see some of the photographs of that effort. We provided the architecture. We provided some of the training capacity on how to finance it. Groups like the Urban Homestead Assistance Board trained people on how to manage it. And it was not an individual entity. It wasn't Pratt alone. It was Pratt as part of a housing movement, and it committed to that housing movement. These are buildings on a crescent in the Bronx, which the local residents called a banana instead of a crescent. So this is the work of Banana Kelly. And the buildings, as you can see on the left, to your left side, were in devastated condition. The buildings on the right are the facades. And these were the plans that were generated by our architects working with us and students from Pratt. And you can see in 1970, the building here had solar collectors. Because we would then experience a lot of the abandonment was because of the rapid increase in the cost of fuel. And what we learned is that public policy and planning and all the things that we're talking about is really the nexus between organizing people, listening to people, public policy planning, and really recognition of frontline communities and what the communities were doing. And what we did in housing in the 60s, and this is hopefully will be reiterated with the future, my subsequent lecturers, is that the picture here is about a new generation of young leaders that are coming out of communities, particularly communities of color that have been the victims of racial and environmental injustices. And you see here the woman all the way on the left, Elizabeth Yampierre, who has been a major fighter for climate justice. Eddie Batista, who heads up the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, is in the middle, and a young guy there who happens to be their son, because it's a married power couple, but they organize, and it's the organizing that really is the challenges that we all face. I want to just end here by saying that today's challenges need to be turned into opportunities and for a better tomorrow, but that we have to keep in mind that, particularly in the United States, we're a pluralistic society. Here in the Czech Republic, you're a pluralistic society, but you're getting new immigrants in. You're going to be changing. There are social and economic injustices in pluralism. And so we really need to begin to talk about how we build a multicultural, multiracial democracy wherever we are. And I just put this in, and I want to end with that, is that beauty emerges from a non-binary and non-linear thinking. Diversity is a new aesthetic. Diversity equals democracy, beauty, and justice. And thank you. I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much for a very important context of community. I can see there are my colleagues from Participation Office. They can agree that community is foundation of every participation campaign here in Prague. And sometimes they don't know that they are a community. We have to explain them. They find out that they are a community, and we can work with them. Next 10 minutes belongs to Eva Shiffman, urban planner with more than 40 years of experience who focuses on affordable housing and solutions for homelessness. Welcome to camp.
Hello, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to see so many of you in the audience and to be back in Prague. As Ron said, we have both been here several times before, but not for quite some years, and it's exciting to return and see all the changes that have taken place here. I was trained at Pratt as a planner, but I'm not part of the official faculty, but I am part of the Pratt family. And I've worked for nonprofits and for the city of New York for many, many years. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the issues of housing and how the city took a very upfront approach in trying to deal with housing problems that we faced in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We had issues of abandonment, we had issues of homelessness, and we're facing a lot of those same issues again today, as are many other cities. And I hope that looking back at some of the things that were done a number of years ago would be useful and inform some of the ideas of the future. Okay. So just to give you, again, some context of what was happening in the late 70s and 80s. As we've said, there was a lot of abandonment. People were not maintaining their buildings. People were being forced to leave property. But there was a community-based effort to try and hold on to their buildings and to keep their communities going. There were lots of examples throughout the city, in the Lower East Side, in Harlem, and whatever, where those efforts took place and were pushing the city to be more involved. So one of the things that happened was that the city in 1976 gained the ability to take over the ownership of buildings where the owners had not paid their taxes for 1 year. Previously, it had been 3 years. So this was an effort to have more buildings moved into the city ownership and hopefully rehabilitated and given a better life. So that happened in '76. In 1978, the housing agency of the city became responsible for dealing with all of those properties. They had previously been the responsibility of something called the Department of Real Estate, and they were not terribly good at dealing with buildings that had people living them and the like. So the city took over many of these buildings, maybe 4,000 by that time, and they managed them directly, sometimes doing a good job, other times not so great. But again, through pressure from advocates and community members, the city created some new programs to try what was called an alternative way of managing these city-owned properties. So our acronym was DAMP, the Division of Alternative Management Programs, and they were primarily for community-based organizations and tenant groups to manage their own buildings. At that time, I worked for a large nonprofit called the Community Service Society, and we worked with a lot of other organizations in trying to promote these programs and get people to really be behind them. And one of the things we did was have a conference on these programs to inform rather, more community folks on what their options were. And in fact, we called that conference jokingly Damp at Camp. So we were sort of using some of the same language at that time. But those programs were very successful up to a point. The one called the Tenant Interim Lease Program, where tenants could manage their buildings, oversee some of the repairs, and then ultimately become the new owners of those properties, has been going on till almost the present time. And tenants could buy their apartments for maybe $250 for an apartment, which was really quite the bargain. So those were the programs of that time. But the city still continued to have a vast number of vacant buildings that were under their jurisdiction. And the homeless crisis was not really abating, and many low-income families were in need of housing. So again, through a lot of pressure from community folks, some elected officials, and whatever, some new programs were created. Something in what that was called the Division of Homeless Housing and Development was in existence for about a dozen years. And in that period of time, and I was part of that, part of the agency, the housing agency. And in those 12 years, approximately 18,000 apartments were rehabilitated. Over $1 billion in capital funds were expended. And those 18,000 units, brought lots of improved housing for both single individuals and families of low income and people with some special needs. One of the programs that I ran was something called the Construction Management Program. This was a new idea of the cities to try and deal, again, with a large number of buildings that it owned that were vacant, and it took a different approach. It was looking at doing lots of buildings in the same area, what we would call a neighborhood approach, and in fact putting a lot of money into the rehabilitation. Some of the other programs that I mentioned earlier for city-owned properties, they made minimal repairs, but was never really to the extent of repairs that were needed in some of the properties. So construction management was an effort to use private construction managers to oversee the rehabilitation of large groups of buildings at one time, rehabbing the buildings to a high standard. We used the standards of the Public Housing Authority in the city of New York, which was very different than what had been done before. Most importantly, what the program tried to do was bring together a mix of formerly homeless, low and moderate income families. And when the work in the buildings was completed by the city, the buildings would be turned over to a nonprofit sponsor of whom it was expected that they would not only manage the buildings physically, but provide social programs for the tenants and other members of the community. So it was, again, looking beyond just the physical, but looking at the needs of the people who lived in those buildings and having a neighborhood focus. The picture here is of the housing commissioner for the housing agency taking a tour with an important developer and governor, or not, yeah, for the brother of the governor, somebody called David Rockefeller, whose name you might have heard, a rather wealthy, influential person in our city. And the gentleman I guess on my left, was our supervisor for the construction in the Bronx, and he talked about the project that he was working on as being as big as trying to tackle building an Empire State Building, because there were, I forget, almost 100 floors in all of the buildings together in the project that he was working on, and maybe 1 million square feet of property. So looking a little bit more closely at the construction management program, there were 2 sites, one in the Bronx that had 14 buildings with almost 900 units, another site in Harlem where there were 45 smaller buildings totaling about 700 apartments. And the work on these buildings was supposed to be done in 2 years, but in fact it took 3. That was still rather amazing for anything being done, under city auspices. And as I said, it was looking at doing what we call a gut rehab. At that time, we spent about $100,000 per apartment, which is probably $400,000 or $500,000 nowadays. But it was significantly more than what had been done in previous efforts. And some of the financing for that rehabilitation came from excess revenue from Battery Park City, which was a luxury housing development in the southern part of Manhattan. And the profits from that project were used to develop low and moderate income housing. So again, I said there was a mix of families in these projects. Some of the early efforts to deal with homeless families put 100% homeless families in a building and without a lot of services or other things to help them rebuild their lives. So this notion here was that you do a mix of people who had been homeless, very, very poor families of low income, and then more, not terribly rich, but slightly better off working families. What we also did in the Bronx site was include on-site a daycare facility and playgrounds that were staffed, for the young children in the buildings to use. And the nonprofit sponsor also was required to provide all kinds of social services for the families. So they did things like education programs, helping families and individuals get their high school equivalency degrees, job training, job preparation, and the like. So it was really as I said before, not only to deal with the physical repair of the buildings, but to really help the families rebuild their own lives. These are some of the completed buildings in the Bronx, and an article from the New York Times which likened the city's effort with construction management and various other programs to the building of the pyramids in Egypt. So you can see the headline says the pyramids of New York. And we were very excited to see that description and acknowledgement of the effort that went into a very needed effort. And another article several years later, talking again about the Bronx project and the success of mixing the various folks who were living in the buildings and how people were very, very happy to be living in those projects. And there are some folks who are, talking together and rebuilding their community. So I just wanted to give you an example of what can happen if the city has the resources and the will, or is pushed into doing things for the populations that are most in need. I think a lot of conversations today talk about building a lot more housing, but they don't really necessarily focus on the people most in need. And this was a short period of time where I think the right thing was happening, but I think it's an interesting example to look at as we contemplate dealing with our current conditions of the lack of affordable housing in New York and throughout other places. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to David Burney, co-founder and director of the Urban Placemaking and Management Program at the Pratt Institute. Welcome to camp.
Thank you very much. I see we're out of time, and we've got 3 more speakers still to come. So I did warn Yvette, 5 academics from Pratt, that's 8 to 9 hours at least, so I hope you don't have dinner plans, but no, I will try to speed it along. So I was asked just to put together a general introduction to sort of governance and policy making in New York City, particularly as it pertains to planning and development. And of course, New York City, the world center of laissez-faire capitalism, are there any controls at all? Well, there are some. And I'll try to give you a little overview of what that is. So New York City, as many of you probably know, is made up of 5 boroughs. It wasn't always that way. The borough of Brooklyn at one time was an independent city and is the largest borough of the 5. But in 1898, it was united with New York City. If it was separate, Brooklyn would be, I think, the 3rd or 4th largest city in the nation, so it's one of the larger boroughs. The populations there, Manhattan has about 1.5 million, Brooklyn has 2.5 million. The total population is close to 8.3 million now. The overall, what we call the tri-state area, which includes the commuting suburbs around New York City, is close to 27 million. So it's a pretty substantial population to be dealing with. The New York City is governed by a charter. The city has its own charter, and the basic fundamental attitude of that charter, and this is something that struck me. I'm a transplant from the UK, and one thing that struck me when I came to the United States was the fact that despite the sort of wide diversity among the states and the cities, the basic structure of governance is actually very consistent. And it's based predominantly on the original idea of the separation of powers when the US Constitution was written. And the decision to kind of avoid the tyranny of the monarchy or any other tyranny was to separate governance into 3 basic divisions: an executive that would run day-to-day operations, a legislature that would pass laws, and a judiciary that would adjudicate between the two, and that these 3 governing bodies would act as a counterbalance to each other, so that there could not be tyranny of any one of them. And that actually model just goes on down through the whole system, that we have the president at the federal level, the Supreme Court, and the Congress. At the state level, we have the governor, now Kathy Hochul, the state assembly, and the state court system. And at the city level, in New York City, we have a mayor, Eric Adams, we have a city council, and we have our municipal courts. So this model of governance goes on right through, notwithstanding the different politics of different cities and different states. So the mayor is the in charge of the executive, basically has wide control over most of the functions that go on in the city, whether it's sanitation, whether it's police, whether it's education, whether it's housing policy. A great deal of the authority of executive power is invested with the mayor. We have another position called the controller, and this was a position created in the 70s after New York City's bankruptcy, when the city was kind of bailed out from its financial issues. The idea of the controller was to provide some kind of budget governance over the city. So the controller has the authority to manage the city's investments and to oversee city's contracting. So that's actually a pretty powerful position. It's currently occupied by a Pratt graduate, Brad Lander, and we expect one day he may be our mayor. We don't know. And then each borough has its own president. And at one time, the borough presidents were quite powerful. The boroughs had control over what was called the Board of Estimate, and that managed most of the contracting work that the city did. In the 80s, this was challenged because of the lack of kind of real democratic representation, because each borough president had the same voting power, but obviously there was a huge disparity between the populations of those boroughs. So it was determined by the courts that it was really undemocratic. The power of the borough presidents was largely taken away and given to the council, which is a much more directly elected body. And the borough presidents now have a small budget and some power and some influence on local policy, but not the authority that they once had. We also have somebody called the public advocate, which is a kind of an ombudsman who helps people who are having difficulties with the city administration. They act as a kind of bully pulpit, a kind of counterpoint to things that the administration does. And it's also actually a platform toward the mayoralty. Many public advocates, the previous mayor, de Blasio, had been the public advocate previously. So it's also a step toward the mayoralty itself. So the city council is directly elected by the population. The city council members are allocated according to the size of the population. So Brooklyn, being the largest borough, has the most council members, and Staten Island the least. They serve a term and they're re-elected over that period. The city council elects its own speaker. It's a pretty powerful position, and the city council is essentially in charge of legislation. They do all of the legislation, they hold committees, they have public hearings, they promote legislation. The laws that they pass go to the mayor for approval. If the mayor signs them, they become law. If the mayor vetoes them, they can be overridden by a majority, by a two-thirds majority of the council, and that's their sort of primary function. Then we have 59 community boards around the city, and the community boards were established in the 70s as a way of devolving some authority to local communities. And they were originally called community planning boards. Some people called them little town halls. And the concept was that they would be able to represent the communities, they would produce statements of need, they would feed that need into the city hall administration, and that was a way of kind of empowering local communities. It has not always worked out quite as intended, partly because the community boards tend to be rather underfunded. They tend to lack some of the technical expertise, particularly in planning and development issues, and they also lack a certain authority. They are purely advisory. So they have a role in the planning process, but their role is always advisory, and of course that immediately means that they can and are often ignored. Some are more active than others. There are lots of plans afoot now to reinforce their authority, to give them more money and give them stronger powers. But it's an issue, it's an ongoing issue, particularly in the development process in the city. So these are the community boards. The community boards, oddly enough, don't quite align with the city councils. So there's a kind of a little mismatch there between the community board boundaries and the city council boundaries. There's a certain amount of overlap. I'll skip this. This is just the horrifying number of people that the mayor has to supervise. I worked for 10 years for the mayor during the Bloomberg administration. I was in one of those little boxes down there. And I'm going to skip some of this detail just in the interest of time. And then I will just talk a little bit about zoning. So although we think it's a free-for-all in New York City. It's not quite that way. This is New York City in the 1870s. And interesting enough, I mean, apart from all of the ships that you see there, and at that time, of course, most of the goods were coming in and out of the city by boat, you see how low-rise it is. I mean, these are masonry buildings, seldom more than 5 or 6 stories. If you can walk up 6 stories, okay, but there was seldom anything higher than that. So although it was very congested, it was really not very high-rise, fairly low buildings, limited by the structural ability of masonry construction. And then, of course, in the middle of the 19th century, a couple of important things changed. Mr. Otis invented the elevator, the safety elevator, and the steel frame, which really began its heyday in Chicago, sort of liberated buildings from the limits of masonry construction. So with a steel frame and an elevator, never mind 5 or 6 stories, you could go 20, 30, what is the Empire State Building, 107. So the immediate consequence of that, of course, is this, that you get suddenly enormous densities. And this really triggered a thought among the city that, well, how much density can we really sustain? Infrastructure, power, waste management, energy, traffic, and so on. How far can we really go? So the idea of limiting development came into play. And in 1916, New York City introduced its first zoning resolution. And the original zoning resolution was largely a matter of getting light and air into the streets. And you see the famous wedding cake buildings in Lower Manhattan that were set back to allow light and air in. And that shifted later to the idea of plot ratio, or what we call floor area ratio, which is a way of limiting the amount of development by limiting the amount of space that can be built on an individual lot. So if you have a plot ratio of 1, you can build a building entirely across the lot, or you can build a building of 2 stories on half the lot, or 4 stories on a quarter, and so on. So this became the sort of basic method of controlling the extent of development. And it varies across the city. In the big downtown business districts, you can build 25 to 30 times the lot. In other lower density areas, you might be limited to 2. But this is a way of controlling the overall extent of development throughout the city. There was also the concept of land use, and this is a time when people were anxious to separate manufacturing from residential so that the toxicity of manufacturing wouldn't impinge on residential housing, also to separate out commercial, and that resulted in really 3 types of main zoning district: residential districts, commercial districts, and manufacturing. That's actually under a certain amount of reconsideration because most of the really sort of toxic manufacturing has long since left the city, and manufacturing now is really something that's fairly benign, and that many people want to live and work in the same place. So the idea of having mixed-use districts is coming back. So that part of the zoning is under reconsideration. So in terms of building and development in the city, there are 2 things. There's the zoning resolution that I just described that limits the bulk and size of buildings, that limits the use. And then there's the building code, which addresses health and safety issues, fire safety, structural safety. If you read those 2 documents, design your development or your building in compliance with those 2 documents, you are what we call as of right. You just go, you get your permit, you build, nobody will tell you what to do, nobody will tell you how to do your business. And 90% of the construction that goes on in New York City and reconstruction is as of right. It complies with those 2 controls. However, the major developments that go on, generally speaking, have to have some sort of alteration to the zoning code in particular, whether it's height and setback, whether it's use, whether it's technical issues, and they go through a separate process called the Uniform Land Use Review Process, called ULURP. And it is a statutory process to make sure that it doesn't take too long, where the developer works with the city planning department to technically prepare a proposal. That proposal goes to the community boards. The community boards get 30 days to review it, to hold hearings. It then goes to the borough president, then goes to an organization called the City Planning Commission, which is a representative of appointed people who review that process. It then goes to the city council, and if it's approved, to the mayor, and then the project is approved. So this is a pretty standard process. There are all sorts of issues with it that perhaps others will discuss, not least of which is that the community boards, who are the first to get a bite at the apple, so to speak, are only advisory. They're often not involved in the process of developing the project before it comes to this ULERP process. And the City Planning Commission has its limited period. So one of the issues has been that the projects are basically developed in camera, that the communities don't really see them until it's too late, and the ULEP process isn't terribly effective in bringing community concerns to the table. So we can talk about that later also. I'm going to skip through this. And then the second thing I ought to just explain is the issue of landmarking and historic preservation. So up until the 60s, there was no preservation of buildings in New York City until there had been a movement to promote preservation, but it hadn't really gained serious traction or public attention until this happened. This is Pennsylvania Railway Station, one of the major, I think it's the biggest rail transit station in the country. This is a building designed by Kim Mead and White, a famous and rather glorious temple to transportation. The Pennsylvania Railway Station, who owned the station, sold it to a developer. And the developer decided, because there were development potential above the station, to demolish it and build something else. And there were huge protests. Jackie Kennedy, Jane Jacobs, Philip Johnson, the architect, all out protesting. The protest fell on deaf ears. The developer went ahead, demolished the wonderful station, and built this horrible thing in its place. And unfortunately, not only is it horrible on the outside, it's pretty horrible on the inside as well. Instead of these glorious train hall, you had these cramped conditions. So this triggered an enormous backlash, and the city went about drafting legislation to empower the city to preserve buildings that were of architectural merit. It went to the Supreme Court, the city eventually prevailed, and now we have a landmark preservation law. So buildings that are over 30 years old, that are of architectural merit, can be designated by the landmark process and protected. And there's a whole process for that, public hearings and so on. And there are now many, many buildings across the city that are preserved. And also now we have historic districts. So those are neighborhoods in which there may not be individual buildings of great historic merit, but a whole neighborhood may have a certain typology that's of cultural and historic significance, and those are historic districts that are also preserved. So we have these two things. We have our planning controls, our zoning controls, we have our landmark preservation, and these are the things that govern most of the development that goes on in the city. And I think I'm going to just pass through most of this. I will just mention a couple of things. One is that, and I think this really started to emerge in a serious way during the Bloomberg administration, that the idea of moving the city's attention from what had essentially been a question of traffic management to the idea of complete streets, pedestrianization, cycling, and so on. This is famously Times Square, one of the first plazas that were created during that time. And it went on to be the idea of a public space within a 10-minute walk of everybody in the city. Not necessarily a big park, but even just a small public plaza. And there are now, I think, over 90 plazas in the city. This has been a huge program. Open streets, this happened during the pandemic when people had to spend more time outside. And the idea of closing streets to traffic altogether and handing them over to pedestrian activity, and that's prevailed. It's continued after the pandemic and is a growing plan in the city now. I'm going to skip this one, and I'm going to just mention a couple of other things. You may have heard that congestion pricing was coming to New York City. This was the idea of limiting vehicle access into Lower Manhattan by charging a fee. And the funding, which was significant from that program, was to go to fund public transit. It passed, and it was almost to be implemented this month, but the government, for various political reasons, decided to postpone it and put a hold on it, and so that's a big issue now that's being debated in the city. And the final thing I mention is a new proposal by the current administration called the City of Yes. And this had three components. It had an idea of carbon neutrality, moving the city to a more sustainable platform of carbon reduction, of economic opportunity, of sort of deregulating, making it easier for people to do business, and a number of factors to try to improve the supply of housing. It's all been very controversial. The process by which it's been reviewed has been controversial. A couple of the issues, carbon neutrality and economic opportunity, has passed. The housing opportunity is still under discussion, but that's probably one of the big topics that's under discussion in the city right now. So I will leave it there, and we will go, I think, to Eva. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And next 10 minutes belongs to Eva Hanhardt, expert on the context of social justice. She, for example, worked at the NYC Department of City Planning.
Thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to be here. I was born in Prague and have visited actually quite frequently in recent years, but usually with family and not as a professional. So this is a very exciting moment for me as well, and I'm really happy to share with you my experiences. And I was asked to talk about social justice and equity in the planning for the waterfronts in New York City. And so just like the Vltava River here has played a big role historically, but also currently in the development of Prague, the New York City harbor, the East River, the Hudson River, the Atlantic Ocean, Jamaica Bay, Long Island Bay, the Bronx River and tributaries, such as Newtown Creek and Gowanus Creek, are also very fundamental. The city of New York has 520 miles. Now, I don't know exactly how many kilometers that would be, but it is a very, very long number of miles or of distance along the waterfront, which means you have very, very different waterfronts. And as you saw with the map that David showed before, there are many, many community districts. Those are the district areas where community boards that they cover, really are along waterfronts. So you see quite a bit of interest and participation. And interestingly enough, that activity and that development is very much determined by the character and the population that is in those neighborhoods that adjoin the waters. So I want to do just a very quick, and I'm not going to read through all of it, but a context for waterfront history and its current status. Because historically, New York City had been a great port. It had a lot of industry along that waterfront, and people worked on the waterfront. But at the same time, many of those areas, because much of it was industrial, were polluted and were contaminated by industrial wastes. There were no environmental laws that really controlled how industry related to or how it dumped or did not dump into the waterways. There were communities that lived and built their housing directly behind because it was worker housing, because much of the New York population worked in those on the ports and in the industries that grew out of the raw materials that were being brought in through waterborne transportation. There were ferries and other boats that traversed, but people really did not have a chance to get to the waterfront, nor, to be honest, was it a very appealing place to be, given how contaminated it was. When industry left, and the area, and New York City was left with areas that were abandoned, that were deteriorated, and many of the brownfields, like I know you have here in Prague as well. But then became the question, well, how, in fact, and should they be reused? What should be done? With the port itself, many of the maritime, the boating, and the shipping uses also left. So you really had a very big challenge. What was going to happen to that waterfront? How was it going to be a very positive force? Then one of the things that really happened was in America in about 1970, and it was actually slightly before that, there was a book that essentially said that, yes, we may be polluting the environment, but by the way, when you've polluted the environment, in particular the waters, you are actually ruining your health. And it was called Silent Spring, and it really gave birth to a whole new concern about environment. There was something that in America was called Earth Day. It really brought about an awareness of the importance of addressing clean water and clean air. And there were the establishment of new environmental laws, which really changed the way that the water was dealt with. And it really, in a place like New York, resulted in clean water. You can today swim in the rivers and the water, not just in the Atlantic Ocean, which of course we were not successful in polluting totally. But we tried. We used to send our sewage there for many, many years. But there was also another change that began to happen because, as I said before, you really didn't have access. And then there was a planned highway. Many of the highways were planned and built by Robert Moses, who was in the planning history, was someone who planned really for cars and not for people. And there was a highway along the west side of the Hudson River, which is probably one of the most historic waterfronts in New York. And there was a lawsuit that was done by a civic group, in point of fact, that sued the idea of a major extension of that highway to a 6-lane highway along the waterfront. And they won. Now, interestingly enough, because we had the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act, they won because of the striped bass, which is a fish. And it really began to change. And if any of you have ever been in New York, there's a beautiful waterfront park that was developed now along the Hudson River. And the roadway is still there, but it's really not a 6-lane highway. It is a roadway that has stop signs, it has traffic lights, and is much more like a normal highway. So those give you a bit of a history of sort of the transformation of what had been truly a working waterfront to what is now a more rediscovered waterfront and a place that's being redeveloped. The current challenges, though, and that's what many community groups have been facing and looking at, is that pollution still continues. It continues from industrial uses, but it also has been continuing from the very things that were built to clean up the environment, and that is many of the municipal infrastructures, whether they're energy-based or solid waste-based or sewage-based. Much of that actually comes about, and many of the brownfields have not been redeveloped. And so when there's flooding, you actually have quite a bit of pollution that comes about and goes back into the rivers. The second is climate change, and that's a global problem that is facing many places. In New York City, if you look at the map to the side there, you will see that the areas that are colored are the degrees to which parts of the city are at risk if you have a storm, a significant storm. And much of that mapping has been based on a hurricane that was faced. You see the flooding that, you see a boat going down the street. Now, much of the new redevelopment that has taken place, and I think people are familiar with some of it. I showed a picture of the West Side Highway or the West Side Park. I'm sorry, the Hudson River Park, not the highway. As it goes from lower Manhattan all the way up practically to Harlem. And the redevelopment, but that has caused actually the increase in property values because now it's a great place to live. And one of the dilemmas has been that the development has really resulted in gentrification and gentrification pressures because much of it has been luxury. And it's also only happened in market-driven areas because that's where the interest on the part of developers has been for the creation of new housing or new developments along the waterfront. The one that I'm showing in the far corner is a new development in Williamsburg, which again, many of you may have heard about. It's architecturally a very interesting one. It was based on a competition, among other things. And it is made up of a number of new buildings in an area that had been an industrial area that was backed by a large, essentially low-income Latino population, a Hispanic population, Spanish population. There is a waterfront development that has happened there and public access. However, there is a great fear, and not an inappropriate fear, that people will be pushed out as the development has improved the area. So it's not that they wanted the brownfields or the polluting industry, but this development has not proven to be much more welcoming of that community. Over 20% in the last decade of the Spanish-speaking population has been forced out because of price changes. Now, let me talk a little bit about the context of the municipality and what it did in terms of comprehensive planning for the waterfront. And New York City, as David said, uses zoning instead of a comprehensive plan most of the time. So they say whatever has been zoned is very much like in Prague, you talk about your master plan. And so if you do what, but in order to meet the guidelines for clean water and clean air, but in particular for the clean water of the federal level, that delegated monies and responsibilities to the state, which then said to New York, well, you can develop how you want to plan, but you have to come up with a comprehensive plan because you cannot get the money to do these policies without, or these improvements, without a plan that shows us that you're going to use this money properly. So the first plan, which I actually worked on, was a plan that looked at the natural waterfront, the nature along the waterfront itself, including the river, a working waterfront, which was my responsibility, which looked at both industrial development, but also recreational boating, looked at shipping that came in, looked at what was left of the port, the public waterfront, which was, as I mentioned before, the public had no access really to the water before. And the public waterfront was very important because it became something that the zoning required. And we now in New York require any new development. It used to be at the time that I worked on it for new residential development and new commercial development to provide public access. And we were able to do that for public property, for private property, because of, and we discovered an old English law, an old English common law, which said that any land that was touched by the waters must remain in the public domain. So although the private property owner owned the land up there, they had to provide public access. And we have had a number of instances, and if you will go to New York, you will see that that's where the public has now been able to have access, with a goal that eventually some of that you'll be able to walk all the way around those 520 miles. At that time, I was unable to convince them that it could be done for certain industry, an industrial area where the workers themselves could have actually had access to sit at the water's edge. That changed. But now we've developed a separate zoning resolution with regulations for what you could build on the waterfront. And we looked at each area, a sub-area, which we called reaches, to make sure that it responded to what the conditions were in each of the areas. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through some of the changes, because in 2011, there was another plan that was developed, and it involved many of the same issues. However, climate resilience was added. That had not been there. We had not considered climate change. It never at the time that we did the first plan, we never realized what the impacts of climate change would be in terms of flooding, in terms of storms. So another jump, and we are in 2021. And when the most recent plan, well, look at what happened. Now we moved not just from place and not just from physical environment or ecology, we moved to people. We talked about the values, and the focus now are on equity, resilience, and essentially justice. In other words, the ability for everyone, it says, it now is committed to a climate justice principle that all New Yorkers, not just, as I mentioned before, the market-driven areas where there was interest in development, but in all of the city. And in recent years, I believe that it has made that change. Why did that change happen? Not because they gave up on water quality or on the environment, or even on redevelopment, but it happened, I believe, because of the increased respect, involvement, and participation of local communities, which really brought their experience to the table that led to this recognition of both people and place. The move to the fact that it was the people who enjoyed the waterfront and that the people who lived there mattered. So I want to talk a little bit, just if you'll forgive me, to talk about the title of our conference here, which is Hyperlocal in Architecture and Planning. So I looked up what hyperlocal meant. As a planner, it's odd. I know the architects use it a lot. But as planners, I always thought of it as community planning. But that's okay. I'm really important that architects have discovered it as well. Now, and it's a reflection of local history, okay, culture, and the needs of the community. But the question really is, who defines that? Is it the professional who defines it? Is every community sort of defined similarly? And sustainability, which I have a quote here from it's sort of a prominent sustainability person in America named William McDonough. It says, all sustainability, like politics, is local. So it is, what are you sustaining? What are you working on? So my challenge here is, what is the relationship of technical expertise, like mine or yours, and local expertise? Mind you, I use the word expertise. And that's the premise that I really want to bring to this conference. And that is that it's not just involving or in communities or informing communities, it's really learning from the expertise that they bring to the table and that they can show. And so what I've chosen, because there are many community organizations and community-based groups, I've chosen to talk about those that, for me as a planner, taught me what holistic planning was, that really taught me, after many years, after 30 years of working for the city, I really never understood it till I worked with the environmental justice community. And Ron had mentioned to me I should define what that is. In the United States, although globally it is similar, it represents communities that are primarily low income, in New York, primarily communities of color, but who have borne the burden of environmental impacts historically, and who have really shown how they themselves, by doing their own plans and generating plans that represent their communities, can identify social, economic, cultural, and environmental problems. And what's most important, they will develop equitable, effective, and creative solutions. The fact is that they are not the enemy. They are not the naysayers. They actually are experts, and we have a lot to learn from them. Now, I'm not going to go through this because it's a lot of information, and I'm leaving it with you, especially for the milestones and documents, so that for those of you who are interested in this movement, because it is a global movement as well. And I think in the Czech Republic, probably you also have communities that deal with environmental justice. They just may be different communities than what we have. And some of the principles are very important. But the important thing was that, so why didn't the experts figure this out? Why didn't the environmental scientists really come up with and lawyers come up with the laws that kept those communities from being impacted year after year after year? Well, it was because they were looking for the benefits that benefited most people. So the problems in one local community, well, you know, there just weren't enough people there for it to really matter, or for it to be really addressed in the same way. And also, often, as I mentioned before, the sewage treatment plants, the energy plants, were things that were making the environment better for everyone, but they had impacts, and they were all being put in those communities, in those older industrial communities that became what we would, or what is called, sacrifice zones. And so it became, there are certain places, well, you know, for the greater benefit, for the public good, there were some places that just had to sacrifice themselves to have those facilities that still did pollute. And I do want to mention also the fact that the climate justice, which I mentioned before in the new plan, really grew out of the environmental justice movement, but it grew out of this understanding of really that you could not just stop pollution. You actually wanted to have what is called a just transition, because many of the businesses were the businesses where these same low-income people worked. And so putting them out of business meant losing jobs. And this is true around the world. It's why you sometimes have so much resentment towards climate justice and a lack of looking at regulations that might be putting many people out of business. Whoops, I went one too many. So Ron mentioned the Environmental Justice Alliance, which is a group that is a citywide alliance, and I want to stress the importance for any community-based plans or any of you who are NGOs to, in fact, work in alliance with others. If you look at the map, you'll see that they're spread out throughout the city, but you will also see that many, if not most of them, are along waterfronts. I'm not going to go through all the programs they do. You see over there the rally. It was over, if I'm correct, over 300,000 people that gathered to call for climate justice. And it's the people's climate justice. Now, the Environmental Justice Alliance, and this is an important point, is, first of all, it's run by its membership. It has many different programs. I won't go through all of them, but I have given you their website, and I do encourage you to do that, to go and look. But they were founded, first of all, to identify the problems that had caused the conditions they were in, and to develop strategies to dismantle. That means that they were to come up with alternatives and approaches, whether they were developments or policies. And so in each of these areas, climate, waterfront, waste, energy, transportation, heat, and other programs, and I won't go through all of them because if you do go to their website, it's very exciting and there are fantastic examples to look at. But it's looking that this is all a total picture, but their point is not just to complain about it, but to actually come up with strategies that will change it. And I'm going to go through just a few, and I'm going to go through these as quickly as I can, of organizations. There's one, We Act, and I want to stress, I heard in Prague people say, oh, it takes so long to get something done. You know, it goes through a very long process. Well, sometimes things take time, and sometimes you have to stop something bad before you can promote something good. And so I'll give a couple of examples. Many of these organizations started by stopping things that would have been terrible, both for their community and in some cases for the city as a whole. So originally there was a sewage treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant that was planned for 70th Street. But 70th Street was a middle-income neighborhood, and people objected to it. So where did it get moved? It got moved up to Harlem and on the waterfront, where the assumption was that, well, you know, there would be less opposition or less powerful opposition. But they fought it, and they eventually sued the city, which they got $1 million in damages because the city had actually for the impacts and the health impacts from it. And I have to tell you that although they have not won getting it out of there, they, because it was built, what happened was that even though there are odors and other impacts, they monitor them, and a state park was built on top to make it more palatable. I'm not sure the community would have preferred getting the state park without the sewage treatment plant, but nonetheless. A lot of the effort, all the diesel bus depots, so all the buses that had fossil fuel, were run by fossil fuels, were being parked in Harlem. So they all came through, and this group was very instrumental in the transition from diesel fossil fuel to electric buses. And I believe firmly that the city would never have adopted the program towards electric buses except for their activism. And mind you, this was in the 80s. And in the meantime, and as you see, I can't do PowerPoints, West Harlem piers were developed. It's a park. If you look, you'll see people lounging now on the beach in an area that would have been a waste transfer station before, a solid waste transfer station. The other group across the way is not in Manhattan, but is in Brooklyn. It's El Puente, which is in that Williamsburg neighborhood, which I talked about, some of the anxiety about new development. And one of their beginnings, and one of my mentors was a community leader there named Luis Garden Acosta. And Luis Garden Acosta went to fight what was a proposal to build I think one of the world's largest incinerators to burn waste in the middle. And I put the map there. If you see the little red dot there, it would have been smack in the middle of New York. But the health impacts, even though they said there'd be a filter, well, the number of operational upsets was huge. So he got together. Now, these are alliances that can be made with people that, you know, you would imagine they're not working together normally. They would fight over sometimes housing, or in fact, the Hasidic community and the Latino community. And together, they marched across the bridge in Williamsburg, and they stopped the incinerator. Now, that's why I mentioned stopping it, that although sometimes many of these groups, and my story is that they're positive ideas and positive things they do develop, but sometimes you have to stop a bad thing before you do a good one. So I'll go very quickly to the Green Light District. You see there one of the community gardens that has been working, among other things, looking at herbs and other health issues. I have two more neighborhoods just very quickly. One is, again, in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and there they've developed parks with the Parks Department, working with municipalities, working with the city in partnership, but where they've identified how it can meet their needs, where it meets their needs, and it is in that industrial area where I was not allowed to require the access before. They have a community solar, which is being built on top of a city, used to be an Army terminal, and on the roof, It is the community that is going to be sharing it with their neighbors in the upland as a community-owned and a community-regulated solar project, one of the first. And they have come up with what is this just transition strategy called the grid, something that I worked on, that is Pratt has worked on, and I think that Eve will go into detail on, which developed a plan for a comprehensive regenerative economic development that is industrial, that is technology-based, that is green industry, where the workers who otherwise would be losing their jobs from industrial departure would be able to work. Two more examples in the Bronx to show the diversity of the alternative plans and the creativity of those plans. One is an arts festival that, for example, the Point in Hunts Point, which is a center for arts and creativity in addition to environmental justice, has done, and it's an annual one, and it brings awareness to the public and its own community, but also to the city about the waterfront. And these were both done at the time that much of what you saw from Ron and Yvette was a decimated, destroyed Bronx. And if you go there now, it's well and alive. Or youth ministries, which was mostly around work with younger people, and they developed from a concrete plant site a park that, if you can see the two views, you still see the superstructure from the concrete plant. So I'm going to leave you with those examples. There are many others. I've given you the internet sites if you have the chance and the interest, which I encourage you to have, to see the very positive, exciting ideas that have come from the community where they have worked with the municipalities to help realize their visions. And they're not opposition. They're not a problem. We learn from them. So thank you very much.
Now, if you have your questions prepared, it's time for discussion. I would like to ask our speakers to join me here on our stage, and I also would like to invite Eve Barron, chair of the Graduate Center for Planning and Environment at Pratt Institute. She will join us here.
I think I'll just talk briefly about our department and a little bit about the way that we involve communities in our classroom. So I'm not going to go through all of this. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the structure of the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment at Pratt Institute. We have 4 interrelated graduate level programs. They're all based on concepts of urbanism. There's urban and community planning. There's historic preservation, sustainable environmental systems, and urban placemaking and management. So these programs work together, they function together. Students come in through one of the programs and get their foundational skills, and they're encouraged to take electives in the other programs. Let's see, we have a beautiful campus in Brooklyn, New York, historic Clinton Hill. Please come and visit us sometime. And we are within the School of Architecture, which itself is in a historic building with a very prominent postmodern addition in the front. So a big part of what we do is studio. This is how our students really learn how to practice. Practice is really the heart of our programs. You know, we are all mission-based. We're interested in teaching students how to do participatory practice as the best way to achieve sustainable, just neighborhoods. So, you know, this is the ethos behind our studio culture, where the idea is participatory action research, where the people who are most impacted by research are the ones who are actually framing the research, because everyone has experiences, either personal or intergenerational, to bring into a critical analysis. So that's the baseline of our studio practice. We're located in Brooklyn and historic Clinton Hill, but our work is all over the city in all 5 boroughs. Our studio work is interdisciplinary, it's team-based, it provides technical assistance. It's dealing with community priorities, and it's seeking to achieve real-world impact. So I am going to go through these slides more quickly than it seems right now. But what we've done is build on a legacy of relationships and trust with different community-based organizations to involve in the work. So it's a spirit of exchange with community groups, and students bring skills and new energy into the process. Residents bring local knowledge, and a couple of speakers have talked about that. So we acknowledge that community groups' time is limited and that students are still learning. We bring in an awareness of our own privilege. Higher education is not a right in the United States, unfortunately. And the groups that we're working with are oftentimes like racially, ethnically are diverse, but our professions are not. So we're coming from a private institute, graduate students and faculty who come in with a lot of privilege. Our field is not well integrated. We invite community members into the classroom as teachers, and then we send students out into the field with community residents as guides. What we try to do is make the products of the class as useful as possible to community groups, which means putting them into different formats for different types of uses, and we also try to compensate them for their work with us. So for students, it's a complicated, messy process, and working in real time on real life situations can seem very complex. There's a lot of variables that aren't under their control. And they have to leave their comfort zones, but they gain a lot. They gain an understanding of how past planning practices impact people's lives into this day. Ron had talked a lot about the redlining, the segregation, the planned shrinkage that still is impacting the quality of life in different neighborhoods and impacting people's ability to thrive. So, having students learn directly from people who are in those situations is very important to their understanding. They also start to understand by working collaboratively that good ideas come from everyone, and there's no sole author to a good idea. They also learn how to adapt and to be flexible. COVID-19 taught students a lot about how to pivot and how to switch and adapt. They had to learn completely new ways to engage communities. So I'm gonna, in general, communities gain quite a lot of new information, new data that they can use for their own development proposals, to respond to what the city is proposing for their neighborhoods, in a very informed way. They get structured opportunities during the course of the semester to meet with each other and talk about their vision for the future, and most community groups don't have the luxury of doing that on a day-to-day basis. And this is work that community groups don't often have a chance to do for themselves. Is there an impact on the city? Yes, and sometimes. It provides ways to get more effectively involved in participation and public review of land use changes. Again, it goes into new proposals. So new information about demographics, land use changes, other changes can help community groups lobby to get their elected officials to align projects with their own vision. But there's some steep hurdles for impacting city development in general. Much development in New York City, as David mentioned, is as of right. So there's no public review, there's no room for negotiation. We have a strong mayoral system, so there's big brackets around what can actually be impacted. And then there's real estate speculation, which a few people have alluded to, and that's probably the #1 concern for community residents and local businesses, is that finding ways to gain some control over real estate speculation, because that's forcing the rents to rise and for people, and displacing people. So more and more of our work is around things that allow more community control over land use and removing things from market speculation through tools like community land trusts or participatory budgeting. So I'm going to skip the case study that we're talking about, and hopefully we can go straight to discussion. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for a little chaos. And now, please, we would like to start a discussion. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to ask. We heard a lot. It was like a short, dense semester at the Pratt Institute, and now we completed it, and we will discuss those topics. First of all, I would like to ask about New Yorkers, because New York has a population over 10 million people, I guess, and that's like Czech Republic. And we have a different taste in detail, what we see in the city, what we care of. We can discuss with the community about the bench or about the tree. You can see 20 or 30 people discussing and fighting about the one tree that is there. Is it the same in New York City? Is it like the typical New Yorker, typical New York dweller, if it's possible to say something like that, in that metropolitan city? What kind of detail New Yorker can see and can care? What people are interested in the streets when they are meet as a community? Yeah, maybe Eva can start because you know Czech people.
I can say, well, first of all, different communities will have different priorities, and I think that's an important thing. But right now, most New Yorkers care about the fact that nobody can afford the rent. And because New York City is primarily a renter population, most people really are worried that they won't be able to stay in the city because the prices have become so high. And for those people who do own, they're afraid to sell because they can't buy something and stay in the city. And for others, there is a concern about climate change. There's a concern about flooding. There's a concern about storms. And today it was over 100 degrees in New York. And so I think there's a lot of concern about heat. But I'll pass it on to Ron or others. But those, I think, are the broad ones.
I would totally concur with Eva on that. Every community has its own identity, and every community has its own self-interests and priorities. The environmental justice one is very critical. The one thing that differentiates a lot of the work that was shown, and almost every example that Eva provided, except for maybe WEACT, have all come out of projects that the Pratt Center or the Pratt Planning Department have been involved in for 30 or 40 years. So when we talk about El Puente, or we talk about the Point Development Corporation, we've worked on with them when the most important issue was to make sure they didn't lose any more housing. A lot of the success they had is leading today to the problem that Eva just pointed out. The environment has improved so much that developers who fear to tread into those neighborhoods now are coming in and pushing them out. So the issue now is how do we work with them to protect them? At the same time, we've got communities that are so vulnerable to climate change, but don't have the full bandwidth to deal with what will happen 5 years from now, because they're trying to deal with keeping the food on the table today, making sure they're not displaced tomorrow, but may be pushed out, not by any developer, but by nature. And so these are the challenges that communities are beginning to face and how we deal with it.
Do you have any example of the vulnerability of the community? Is a very interesting thing. What is the example of the most significant risk for those communities? Is it the rent, for example, the real estate expenses, or is it the climate change? What is the most significant thing now in Manhattan or New York at all?
One of the things I've always resisted, and everybody we've worked with, is to set priorities. We have to do everything, and we are a city that has the potential to garner the resources to address them, both intellectually and financially. And we're always asked to prioritize, is it more important to have housing or health or education, when all of them are intricately woven together. And our role as planners and interveners is to weave together a whole cloth, not deal with one strand of that cloth.
There is a question on Slido from Ray Spano. Are sweat equity solutions still possible in light of the extreme rise in real estate values in NYC? And if not, what new initiatives are being applied?
If I understand the questions about what new initiatives can lead to the development of affordable housing, is that?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about this earlier today. One thing that New York City does have going for it that most American cities no longer do is public housing. And public housing was a program that's emanated from the federal government. We got funding from the federal government to build housing developments in the amount of 180,000 units. That's quite a lot. It's unlikely that we're going to return to the times when we have that much federal funding to build that much housing again, but that's the kind of model that we need. It's something that dramatic. We do have community land trusts, and that's a different model where communities are purchasing land and holding that in common, and then people buy individual units within the apartment buildings that are built, but the community group retains the control of the land. So it can be maintained affordably in perpetuity. So that is one model. However, the price of land in New York City, of course, is very, very expensive, so it's difficult. But that is a model that's gaining some traction and actually has some support from the New York City government. There are other models of mutual housing, and I think I wanted to turn it back to Yvette, who can talk a little bit more about mutual housing associations and how that can be a model.
One of the programs that took place and an area that was slated for urban renewal was in the lower Manhattan neighborhood known as Cooper Square. And there were folks who organized there, fought the urban renewal that was planned to kind of wipe out their buildings and change the neighborhood a great deal. But after many, many years, they were able to get the city to put some funds into allowing them to stay in the buildings and do some repairs. There was also some money from the federal government that went to support that effort, but it was one of maybe two or whatever, a small number of community land trust projects that was developed in the city of New York. And as Eve said, the community organization, I think it's called the Cooper Square Committee, was given the land under the buildings that folks were living in that had been slated for urban renewal. And as I said, the money was available to repair the apartments and then allow residents to purchase their individual apartments. But they formed something that was called a mutual housing association, which is kind of like a cooperative entity of each building could be considered a cooperative, but then together, I think there were 18 or 19 buildings in that community that formed this mutual housing association, and that's kind of a new model. And when this was all done years ago, it was, as I said, one of very few examples, and not really, folks in the city were not really looking to replicate it, but now it's become something that's talked about in a lot of communities in the city, and recognition that it is a viable approach. However, I'm not sure there are that many properties that are available that would lend itself to that. But one
thing I'd like to add is that there is money if we were able to get the political will to spend it. And all of these programs are technical interventions, but with that money, it doesn't go anywhere in New York or in a market economy. And one of them is that we're the home to the New York State Stock Exchange. And by instituting a surcharge, a stock transfer tax, that is equivalent to $30 on a $100,000 transaction, New York State will generate over $15 billion a year. $15 billion a year, half of which could go to New York City. If you think about what that could do, and it is a de minimis amount on any transfer, that law exists. That law was in operation until the mid-'80s. And at that time, and it was not rescinded. The law exists, the tax is collected every day, but it's rebated instantly. Mm-hmm. And all we need to do is get the legislature and the mayor to agree that they'll keep a little bit of it and dedicate it to the immense need of providing affordable and decent housing for all New Yorkers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly the issue, that there isn't the will to provide the funding. I mean, you know, there was a wonderful exhibition at the Center for Architecture last year of social housing in Vienna. And everybody's like, oh, you know, isn't it wonderful, the housing they do in Vienna, why can't we do that? Austria has a fraction of the GDP that the United States has, the wealthiest country on the planet, and we just don't do it because we don't want to do it. We don't have the wherewithal and the political will to do it. Most of these programs that Yvette described and Eve talked about are well-intentioned and they're effective in a small way, but they're not addressing the real issue, the fundamental issue. And until there's a paradigm change and we accept that social housing is a constitutional right, that it's a social activity, not a commercial activity, we're never really going to solve the fundamental problem.
I wanted to add just one quick thing, and that is that the city is actually put into the zoning now a requirement for providing affordable housing units. If a developer chooses to build a slightly higher, you get an increase in the floor area, the amount of square footage that you can build. If you provide a certain percentage, it's roughly between 20 and 30%, depending on how affordable you're providing in certain neighborhoods. But it means that the developer has to, up until now, it's called mandatory inclusionary housing, and it was done in certain areas. Now the city is proposing that it should happen citywide. But much of it is still voluntary, because if you choose not to have the additional development, then you do not have that requirement.
Thank you. I will ask audience if there is any question. Anyone? I've been interested in, yes? Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. I feel for me it's a little bit difficult to formulate the question because it's a highly complex topic. Already the subtitle of the lecture says 50 years of experience from New York, so we are covering a very, very broad field. And I don't know if others in the audience are feeling this. We are not very knowledgeable about New York, even though some visited. My question goes in the direction of ownership, I think, because ownership, and you just scratched it with the example of Vienna, seems to be one of the instruments to a more affordable housing situation within the city. And it's very, very controversially debated because it's kind of the counter proposal to the private ownership of it. How does New York deal with it? In the presentations of Yvette and Ron, there were some examples from the 60s where there was city-owned housing mentioned, but I have no idea about the scale of it, if it was privatized, if it's being extended, and so on. Could you speak a little bit on that topic? Thank you.
great question. And one of the things that I forgot to say in my presentation was the example that I gave was thought to be, one model that could be replicated and continue to provide a good way of, providing good housing for people. And as I said, the projects were done under city ownership. But as always, politics plays an effect, and as mayors change, laws change. And what happened in New York under Mayor Giuliani was the ability for the city to take ownership of properties when the taxes were not being paid was changed. And the emphasis was no longer on city ownership, and we had the concept of third-party transfers, so that when a property was eligible in the past to have become city-owned, what happened is that immediately those properties did not go into city ownership, but were turned over to another party, initially to a lot of private developers, and I think there was a lot of concern about that, so it changed. And now what happens is that the properties are turned over to a nonprofit or a developer of affordable housing. And whatever is going to happen to rehab those buildings and provide a better housing situation is financed by, basically by loans or other, private input of funds, so that the stuff that I talked about is not happening any longer in the way that it did in the 80s.
Thank you. So there's a chance for a last question from you. Yes, welcome to camp. There's no one with microphone. Yeah.
Thank you for the very inspiring presentations. I have a question. Is it not dangerous to think too much in terms of hyperlocal in the context of the economy that we live in most of the world today? A place like New York City has immense wealth and immense poverty. And you could say the same to different degrees of any major city in the world today. I live in Paris most of the time, and that's where I see it as well. Not to the same degree as I experienced when I had the privilege of working with you, Ron, at the Pratt Center. So don't we have to think more in terms of how the immense wealth that's generated by the businesses and the society that functions in places like New York City gets somehow distributed so that the cleaning person who's working in that gorgeous new office tower is living as decently as the people who are working in that tower or as the developers that are earning their money from producing those buildings?
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think one way of really addressing that is the way I was addressing it a little bit earlier, and that is to take the wealth that's being generated in New York City and redistributing it to the people who really need in order to make the city a much more livable, a much more equitable one. And we are going to need to do something on that level. I think the tragedy that has occurred since Reagan and Thatcher took over the world by their privatization is we no longer dream. We no longer have a sense of what we want to do to provide that equity. And for some reason, we need to begin to think how to dream and how to create a better place. And the reality is that when the oceans rise, we're all going to get flooded. And the only way to deal with that is to work jointly together and to build a community that really bridges the cleaning person in the building with the elevator operator, with the investors in the building. When those plans hit the World Trade Center on 9/11, it was every group in New York City, every income level was decimated. And what we have to do is address the climate change, address the inequities with the same passion that we did to try to address a terrorist. We have to transfer that anger away from people and look at our institutions and make them far more equitable. And we have to do that as professionals, because we can't in any way, as architects or planners or whatever our background is, we can't abdicate our responsibility as citizens. And that's why, to my mind, a part of what we have to talk about is how we create an equitable and sustainable democracy.
Yes?
Can I add one very quick comment on that? That one of the projects that I mentioned, the grid project in Sunset Park, which has taken an area which used to employ many of the people who had lost their jobs, but I don't suggest that there is an answer to paying certain people below a living wage. But even given that, someplace like Sunset Park is proposing jobs for local people who will be trained in the industries and the technologies of the future. And so it's building wealth within poor communities and within poor people. And those are policies that need to be done. And they were very successful in stopping a proposal that would have been prime office and entertainment and saying, no, we want to have a development that will be the cutting edge of new green industry in the city and will be providing the workforce for the retrofit of all of the buildings, including many of the luxury buildings now, in order to deal with climate change.
Very last question.
Well, I will try to bring us to this space of concluding. I think I can't underline more how lucky we are to have you here in Prague with us. But could please each one of you give us one recommendation, like one sentence, for your followers, for the future? Can you try to summarize, like, you know, the principle or a suggestion? I would be really happy. Thank you.
I have one suggestion. I do. Thank you. I appreciate that question. Thank you. This space is remarkable, and we're all very envious of it, I think. And you know, it's a wonderful place to get information, but it could probably go to the next level and become a space of engagement on plans, you know, plans and proposals. So that, you know, that would be my recommendation. You know, just building on like this wonderful space and culture that you already have started, that we would all like to emulate in New York City.
I'd like to make a recommendation. I think you've got this wonderful space. It's and I fully agree with Eve. And it's a space that is educating, and it's bringing people together, and it's bringing the professions together. What if you added to what you're doing here a technical assistance component that begins to provide technical assistance as part of what the camp is doing, using some of your skills that address some of the social and economic and cultural problems within the city and within the region? What if you then go a step further and begin to merge that with dealing with public policy that could then address some of the issues that you're facing? And the issues you have to define. The issues have to emanate from the community itself. But having the technical resources, the space to gather people together, the space to educate them, plus a commitment to continuity. So you're not there just for a day or a week or a year, but you're there for the life of the project and the life of the community. That's a specific recommendation, and I think you can do that.
So I happen to agree with both of my colleagues here, so I won't repeat that sentence, but you have a fantastic area. This building and your program in the building is, well, I'm very envious. But having said that, I would go to something different, and I would say that you should not be afraid of having some policies that give guidelines and regulations to new development, not just new development that the city does or the municipality, but also for private property, because it really needs to be more than hoping that people will do the right thing. And so if I had, I would say that those must be defined, both working with communities in partnership to identify them, but also for the needs that you see. And to not think that some regulation, especially around the climate, is something to be avoided. So that would be my recommendation.
I'm certainly in agreement with what others have said in terms of this facility and using the skills of the professional people involved here. I think you need to look to how you can be more directly involved with community entities if they exist, and I assume they do, and help them to realize their goals. And I think it's important to to also work with the city, but also challenge them to to be more proactive in meeting community goals. So that would be my recommendation.
So I think to add my sentence, I would say get into government and politics. I hear so many architects and planners complaining about the government. Get in there and be the government and be a part of the decision-making process if you can do it.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was Hyperlocal. Thank you very much. Thank you for spending this evening with us, and I hope we will meet soon again.